If I am shot at, I want no man to be in the way of the bullet. Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was given perhaps one of the hardest tasks of any president in the history of the United States. Take the reins from a president who had just been killed in the wake of a devastating civil war, and try to bring the country back together to bond the Union stronger than ever. So, was Johnson able to pull this monumental feat off? Let's find out in this entry in RAC's Presidential Park Series, where we look at U.S. presidents through the national parks that honor and define them. Here we go! Johnson was born in the early 1800s in North Carolina, before running away to Tennessee to open up a tailor shop in the town of Greenville. It was in Greenville where his rise to political power would begin, and several buildings in Greenville, including Johnson's early home and tailor shop, are collectively preserved as Andrew Johnson National Historic Site. A museum at the site also mentions some of his later important moments in life on the national stage. In 1829, Andrew Johnson was elected into the position of alderman in Greenville, and only 5 years later Johnson found himself as mayor of the town. By the end of the decade, Johnson had become a state representative, and throughout the next 2 decades leading up to the Civil War, Johnson would serve in the U.S. House of Representatives before becoming the governor of the state he was now deeply connected to, Tennessee, in the mid-1850s. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Johnson was serving in the U.S. Senate, and although Tennessee broke away from the Union to join the newly created Confederate States of America, Johnson retained his spot in the Senate. During the war, Johnson would help in carrying out the abolishment of slavery by freeing his personal slaves he had owned before the conflict, and in October of 1864, freeing all slaves in the state of Tennessee. President Abraham Lincoln recognized Johnson's long tenure in politics, and during the 1864 election season asked him to be his running mate, replacing Hannibal Hamlin as his would-be vice president. Lincoln won re-election, and thus Johnson inched one step closer to the highest office in the land. It would be only a few months after that crucial election that General Ulysses S. Grant would bring the Civil War to an end. 5 days after the war ended, President Lincoln went to see a play in D.C. when the unthinkable happened. An actor and Southern sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln, who died the next morning. An assassin was also sent to take out Johnson, but his potential killer got drunk and talked himself out of the murder. Thus, in the wake of Lincoln's murder, Andrew Johnson, the tailor and statesman who had spent decades working his way up in politics, suddenly became the 17th President of the United States. And here we pick up where the intro of this video left off. How did Johnson deal with reconstructing the broken nation? Well, Johnson was from the South, meaning when it came to bringing them back into the Union, he was willing to be a lot more lenient than some of the radical Republicans in Congress wanted him to be. Yes, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery was ratified by the states in December of 1865, but many Southern leaders only had to pledge an oath of allegiance to the Union to be readmitted, a far better treatment than what some of the congressmen would have wanted. The first state to be readmitted to the Union was Johnson's home state of Tennessee, and several more states were to follow, but Congress had had enough of Johnson's provisions and essentially took control of Reconstruction, blocking any Congresspeople from the old Confederacy from being put back into their position, and passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, making African Americans official citizens of the United States. In 1867, many Southern states were placed under military rule by order of Congress to make sure the new laws were enforced. Many places such as Beaufort, South Carolina, now home to the Reconstruction-era National Historical Park, underwent massive social and cultural changes as African Americans and whites alike dealt with the aftermath of the Civil War. Congress also restricted the powers of the president, and when Johnson removed his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, from office without the approval of the Senate, 11 articles of impeachment were drafted in an attempt to try and remove him from office. Other federal officials had been impeached before, but never had an impeachment been called against the President of the United States, and it would be over 100 years before another presidential impeachment occurred. Johnson was impeached by the House and tried by the Senate and almost would have been removed for the presidency, but got off by a single vote. Following his impeachment, Johnson was not nominated for the 1868 presidential election, and the war hero Ulysses S. Grant would go on to become the 18th President of the United States, who will be discussed more in the next entry in our series. Johnson did try to re-enter politics after the end of his presidency, however. Running for senator in 1869 and the House of Representatives in 1872, he lost both times, but finally got into the Senate again in 1875, the only president to do so after being president at the time of this video's release. It was during his term in the Senate that he passed away, and at long last, the man who had been through some of the country's darkest hours and politically fought Congress just to stay in office was gone to the ages. Johnson was buried in Greenville, and visitors come to his grave, which is part of Andrew Johnson National Historic Site. Andrew Johnson often tends to receive a bad reputation because of his impeachment and his clashings with Congress, but he still remains one of a select group of people that can call themselves the President of the United States. And although his presidential predecessor set a high standard for what it means to be a president, Johnson ultimately began the work that would start to reunite America after its most devastating war, work that was drafted by Lincoln, argued over by Congress, continued by Grant, and work that we still strive to uphold today. Thank you for watching this entry in our Presidential Park series, and we'll see you next time.